Welcome to episode 16 sa Ignoratia Legis. Kini si J.D. Vance, inyong host sa Ignoratia Legis, October 2, 2020, episode 16. Alright, so, nag-discuss ta sa mga overview sa balaod magkaigsunan. I-follow to ang bar syllabus in terms of topic, not necessarily in terms of depth, pero in terms of coverage. So, discuss natin sa different sa syllabus or contents sa political law, labor law, civil law, taxation, mercantile law, criminal law, remedial law, and judicial ethics. Nakadiscuss natin og introductory sa political law, sa labor law, civil law. O karon introductory ni sa taxation. Now, sa may general principles of taxation, okay, the power of taxation as distinguished from the police power and the power of eminent domain. Kung sa man ang tulo, kanang power of taxation, the police power and the eminent domain, mao ni siya ang three powers, inherent powers of a state. It doesn't even have to be stated in a constitution. It is inherent in being a state. No need for a constitutional mandate for the state to have these three powers: taxation power, police power, and eminent domain. Now, define taxation and distinguish it from police power or eminent domain. Okay. Now, taxation is the mode by which governments make exactions for revenue in order to support sa ilang existence niya mo carry out sa ilang legitimate objectives. The term taxation may refer to either both the power to tax or the act or the process by which the taxing power is exercised. So taxation, the power to tax, that means the power to legislate taxation law, and also taxation power is the power to collect these taxes or enforce these taxes. Sa may logic aning rationally for taxation. It is said that taxes are what we pay for a civilized society. I mean, if you want to have a civilized society, you need to maintain a system. Without taxes, the government will be paralyzed for lack of the motive power to activate and operate the government. The government, for its part, is expected to respond to the form of tangible and intangible benefits intended to improve the lives of the people and enhance their moral and material values. This symbiotic relationship between the government and the citizens is the rationale of taxation, and should dispel the erroneous notion that it is an arbitrary method of exaction by those in the seat of power. It's supposed to be not that. You depend on the government for services, then you should also give the government your tribute or your tax to support the government. Ano siya principle gi layout sa explanation nga gamit sa Commissioner of Internal Revenue versus Alge sometime in 1998. Now, what are the purposes of taxation? Para asa man ang taxation? Now, the purposes of taxation are dual in general: revenue taxation and non-revenue taxation. Not in non-revenue taxation. Yes, there is. I mean, with respect to the general purpose. So, if the general purpose is revenue generation, and it is, in that case, the purpose will be to raise funds or property to enable the state to promote the general welfare and protection sa iyang citizens. Now, if you're talking about the non-revenue or special or regulatory powers of the state, non-revenue, this could be divided into five. This could be divided into five. Non-revenue or special regulatory purpose. Remember, the purpose of this type of taxation is not really to generate revenue, but regulatory or special. Example, A, promotion of general welfare. Kaya taxation may be used as an important implement sa police power in order to promote the general welfare of the people. And B, regulation. For instance, this taxation power may be used sa rehabilitation and stabilization of a threatened industry. So regulating the industry, which is affected by public interest, like the oil industry. So this was the case of Caltex versus COA 1992 case, the purpose of regulation. And then number 3, the reduction of social inequity. It's not really revenue generation, but reduction of social inequality. This is made through the progressive system of taxation, where the objective is to prevent the undue concentration of wealth in the hands of a few individuals. Now, ang gitawag na itong progressive principle is that progressivity is based on the principle that those who are able to pay more should shoulder a bigger portion of the tax burden. This is also known as the compensatory purpose, or the reduction of social inequality, to compensate for the inequality. Now, 4, to encourage economic growth. In the realm of tax exemptions, for example, and tax reliefs, the purpose is to grant incentives or exemptions in order to encourage investments and thereby promote the country's economic growth. Now, remember, this is focusing more on the tax exemptions and reliefs. Then protectionism. Now, in case of foreign importations, protected tariffs and customs are imposed for the benefit of the local industries. Ako, di kayo ko sold out ang mga protectionism. Anyway, sige na lang. In the case of foreign importations, protected tariffs and customs, gi-impose siya for the benefit kunuhay sa local industries. Mga itong local industries, di mo grow, nagsalig man. Okay. Now, what is the nature of the power of taxation? Okay. The power of taxation may be described as follows. Number 1, it is an inherent attribute of sovereignty. The moment the state exists, that's why inherent, you don't have to make a law on this one. Okay. The moment, okay, the state exists, the power to tax automatically exists. It does not need constitutional conferment. This power is inherent in the national government, but not in the local government, or since they are merely an agency of the state for the purpose of carrying out in detail the objects of the government. They can only impose taxes when expressly granted to them by the Constitution or bylaws enacted by Congress. Nevertheless, effective limitations thereon may be imposed by the people through their constitutions. Mactan, MCAA versus Marcos, September 11, 1996, birthday pa yung Marcos. MCIAA versus Marcos. Now, aside from the nature of the power of taxation, aside from it's an inherent attribute of sovereignty, it is also legislative in character. Taxes are a grant of the people who are taxed, and the grant must be made by immediate representatives of the people. Manigitawag ko, no taxation without representation. They are, in effect, a grant, a power given by the people to the state. And then this means that in the legislature primarily lies the discretion as to the nature, the kind, the object or the purpose, and the extent or the rates, and the coverage, the subjects, and the situs, and the place of taxation. This is Chamber of Real Estate and Builders Association, or CRIBA versus Romulo in 2010. It is subject to constitutional and inherent limitations. Dapat say limitations. Ato na i-discuss on sa limitations sa taxation. Now, what are the characteristics of the taxing power? The characteristics are the following. It is comprehensive. It covers persons, covers businesses, it covers activities, professions, rights, and privileges. 2. Unlimited. A tax does not cease to be valid merely because it regulates, discourages, or even definitely deters the activities taxed. The power to tax is one so unlimited in force and so searching in extent that the courts scarcely venture to declare that it is subject to any restriction whatever, except such as rest in discretion of the authority which exercises it. So, unlimited. The power to tax is so unlimited in force and so searching in extent, matod pa sa TU versus Videogram Regulatory Board in 1987. Plenary. So, ang characteristics sa taxing power, comprehensive, unlimited, plenary. Plenary. It is complete under the National Internal Revenue Code. The BIR may avail of certain remedies to ensure the collection of taxes. That means plenary. And supreme, although referred to as the strongest of all the powers of the government, it cannot be interpreted to mean that it is superior to other inherent powers, only that it is supreme insofar as the selection of the subject of taxation is concerned. Now, why is the power of taxation essential? Anong essential na siya? Anong kinahanglan? Anong importante na? The power of taxation is essential because the government can neither exist nor endure without taxation. Taxes are the lifeblood of the government, and their prompt and certain availability is an imperious need. Money ang lifeblood theory, enunciated in the case of Bull versus United States nga kaso magkaisan in the US. So, unsa na to pag-distinguish between the power of taxation, the power of police power, and the power of eminent domain? Sa distinctions. Okay. As to purpose, ang purpose sa power of taxation is to raise revenue primarily. Ang police power as to purpose to promote public welfare through regulations. And then the power of eminent domain to facilitate the taking of private property for public use. By the way, these three powers, as I mentioned earlier, the power of taxation, the police power, and the power of eminent domain are the three inherent powers of the state. Every state must have this one automatically. It doesn't need to be enunciated or declared in the Constitution. As to the amount of exaction, it is unlimited in amount ang power of taxation. As to the police power is limited only to the cost of regulation, issuance of license, or surveillance, like my LTO, my license, driver's license. The power of eminent domain as to exaction. There is no exaction, but private property is taken by the state for public purpose. Alikan kayong lalis ang public purpose. As to the benefits received, the power of taxation, no special or direct benefit is received by the taxpayer, but merely the general benefit of protection is received. Now, as to benefits received from the power of police power, no direct benefit received, but a healthy economic standard is of society known as damnum absci injuria. It's sustained. There is damage, but without injury. Now, as to the power of eminent domain, as to benefits received, just compensation is received by the property owner. As to non-impairment of contracts, under the power of taxation, non-impairment of contracts rule subsists. So you cannot impair contracts. Now, with respect to the police power, as to non-impairment of contracts, non-impairment of contracts rule does not apply. Oh, the non-impairment rule does not apply. And as to the power of eminent domain, non-impairment of contracts rule does not apply. So in both police power and the power of eminent domain, the non-impairment contracts rule does not apply. As to transfer of property rights, and with respect to the power of taxation, the money given by the citizen or the resident paying the taxes, and those taxes that they pay become part of the public funds. Ang metaba sa imong property will become part of the public funds. Now, as to property rights, with respect to the police power, there is no transfer of property rights, but only restraint in its exercise. Now, as to the power of eminent domain, as to transfer of property rights, the transfer of property is effected in favor of the state. Is effected in favor of the state. Okay. As to scope, the power of taxation, it covers all persons, property, and excises. So that's why you have an excise tax. As to the power, the police power, it covers all persons, property, rights, and privileges. As to the scope of the eminent domain, covers only a particular property. As to who may exercise the power, exercised only by the government. The power of taxation may be exercised only by the government or its political subdivision. The police power exercised only by the government or its political subdivision. And the power of eminent domain may be exercised by private entities against other private entities. Okay. Note, when a permit collected from an alien job applicant is in excess of the cost of regulation, the exaction becomes a tax, not just a regulation. Kaya murag sobra naman na may revenue. Villegas versus Hoy Chong Chai, 1978. Now, another note is a charge of a fixed sum which bears no relation at all to the cost of inspection and regulation may be held to be a tax rather than an exercise of the police power. Progressive Development Corp versus Quezon City in 1989. Ano problema ni? Libog na sama ka. Cost of inspection na ni, regulation na ni, or this sum is not related to the cost of infection, now it's considered a tax. Now, Police power, note number 3, police power may not be exercised by itself alone for the purposes of raising taxes. Okay, police power, not for the purpose of raising taxes. However, police power may be utilized or may be exercised jointly with the power of taxation for the purpose of raising revenues. Lutz versus Arizona, Lutz versus Araneta, 1955. Now, kaning 20% discount, o saan, taxation na. The 20% senior discount is an exercise of police power. The discount may be properly viewed as belonging to the category of price regulatory measures which affect the profitability of establishments subjected thereto. On this phase, therefore, the subject regulation, which is the senior citizen person discount, is a police power measure. Manila Memorial Park versus Secretary of DSWD, 2013. Now, what is the determining factor in distinguishing between tax and regulation as a form of police power? Now, in distinguishing tax and regulation as a form of police power, the determining factor is the purpose of the implemented measure. If the purpose is primarily to raise revenue, then it's a tax, though the measure results in some form of regulation. On the other hand, if the purpose is primarily to regulate, then it is deemed as regulation and an exercise of the police power, not the taxation power, even though incidentally revenue is generated. Angeles University Foundation versus the City of Angeles in 2012. Now, what does the phrase the power to tax involves the power to destroy? Kini mga kini mga phrases gikan sa mga American jurisprudence. Power to tax, the power to destroy. Ningo po usa. Saka justice sa US. Ning sunod na as long as this court seats the power to tax is not the power to destroy. Pero sa magipasabot anan the power to tax involves the power to destroy. The power to tax includes the power to destroy if it is used validly as an implement of the police power in discouraging and in effect ultimately prohibiting certain things or enterprises inimical to the public welfare. Note, instead of being regarded as a blanket authorization of the unrestrained use of the taxing power for any and all purposes, it is more reasonable to say that the maxim, the power to tax is the power to destroy, is to describe not the purposes for which a taxing power may be used, but the degree of vigor with which the taxing power may be employed in order to raise revenue. That's phrase ang mga doesn't really matter. Kung sa may inherent limitations sa constitutional limitations sa taxation, what is the scope of the legislative taxing power? Now, ang legislative taxing power or discretion extends to the following. 1. Person, property, or occupation to be taxed. 2. Amount or rate of the tax. 3. Purposes for which taxes shall be levied provided they are public purposes. 4. The kind of tax to be collected. 5. Apportionment of the tax, whether the tax shall be general or limited to a particular locality or partly general and partly local. Situs of taxation, asang lugar sa taxation. The method of collection. These are the scope of the legislative making power. Now, inherent limitations. What are the inherent limitations sa taxation? Okay. The inherent limitations of taxation are taxes must be exacted for public purpose. Dapat public ang purpose. Okay. And international committee. In other words, agreement, international agreements. One of the limitations also sa power of taxation. The power to tax is inherently legislative in nature, and due to the separation of powers, there's non-delegability of the taxing power. Nagod. Pero na rules. Okay. Then, government entities, agencies, and instrumentalities are generally exempt from taxation. And the territoriality or the situs of taxation. A violation of its inherent limitations can amount to the taking of property without due process of law. Pepsi-Cola versus Municipality of Tanawan, Leyte, 1976. Kuwan ka na nga case, importante ka na case sa taxation. Hence, in this sense, it can be said that any tax law contravening any limitation of taxation, in effect, will likewise be unconstitutional. Now, what is meant by public purpose? When is tax considered for public purpose? Now, jurisprudence states that the public purpose should be given a broad interpretation. It does not only pertain to those purposes which are traditionally viewed as essentially government functions, such as building roads, delivery of public services, but also includes those purposes designed to promote social justice. Planters Products Incorporated versus Vertifel, 2008. Note, it is the purpose which determines the public character of tax law, not the number of persons benefited. Okay, nagpaminaw ka mo kang makaigsunan sa episode 16 sa Ignoratia Legis. Okay, kumusta na mo na? Just post your notice. Nari mo sa YouTube pag-post. Okay. Welcome back to episode 16 of Ignoratia Legis, October 2, 2020. Now, on summoning international committee, what's the principle of international committee as an inherent limitation of the power of taxation? The answer. Under this principle, a state must recognize the generally accepted tenets of international law, among which are the rules of sovereign equality among states and of their freedom from suit without their consent, and that limits the authority of a government to effectively impose taxes on a sovereign state and its instrumentalities, as well as on its property held and activities taken in what capacity. Bayron niyo mag-tax ng kuhan di ay US Embassy. Ano siya? Sovereign state man. Note, a state that has contracted valid international obligations is bound to make in its legislations those modifications that may be necessary to ensure and must to ensure the fulfillment sa obligations. Thus, mga laws of issuances, they must ensure that the reliefs granted under tax treaties are accorded to the treaties entitled thereto. Deutsche Bank, Manila Branch versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue in 2013. And what are the basis of the role of International Committee? Now, the basis of the role of International Committee are as follows. 1. The Philippines adopts the generally accepted principles of international law as part of the law of the land, which is based on the itawag na integration theory sa Article 2, Section 2 of the Philippine Constitution. And number 2, ang basis sa rule of international committees, the doctrine of sovereign equality among states. Parem imparem, habeat imperium. So, one state cannot tax another state, even if they are located in the Philippines, like the US Embassy. Now, inherently legislative or non-delegability of the taxing power. Okay. What is the rule on non-delegability of the taxing power? You cannot delegate a taxing power. As a general rule, the power to tax is exclusively vested in the legislative body. This is embodied in the Latin maxim, potestas delegata, non delegare potens, which means that what has been delegated by the Constitution may not be delegated to another entity. This is based on the ethical principle that a delegated power is not only a right, but a duty that the delegate must perform through the instrumentality of his own judgment and not through the intervening mind of another. Quezon City PTCA versus Department of Education, 2016. What are the exceptions to the rule on non-delegability? So, general rule, you cannot delegate. Exceptions, you can delegate. Na, instances na ma-delegate. Amo ni mga bar problems na dapat. The following are the exceptions to the rule of non-delegability. Number 1, it could be delegated to the local governments. Number 2, it could be delegated to the president. Example, the tariff powers by Congress under the flexible tariff clause can be or is delegated to the president. And delegation to presidents, A, tariff powers by Congress, and B, emergency powers under Article 6, Section 23, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution. Now, so first, delegation to the local government, 2, delegation to the president, and number 3, delegation to administrative agencies. We call it the power of subordinate legislation. So, ano na mga wage boards, administrative agencies. Number 4, delegation to the people at large. Bakada Guro Party List versus Ermita, 2005. Note, in every case of permissible delegation, there must be showing that the delegation itself is valid. How do you know whether delegation is valid? That's the next question. What are the tests in determining if there is a valid delegation? It is valid only if the law, number 1, is complete in itself, setting forth therein the policy to be executed, carried out, or implemented by the delegate, or the completeness test. And 2, fixes a standard. So, remember, how do you know that there is valid delegation? General rule, you cannot delegate. Exception, you can delegate in 4 cases. Delegation to the local government, delegation to the president, delegation to administrative agencies, and delegation to the people at large. Now, these exceptions, how do you know that they are valid exceptions? What are the tests and determine they are valid delegations? It is valid only if the law delegating that power, remember it must be delegated by law, is complete in itself, setting forth the policy to be executed, carried out, or implemented by the delegate. It's called the completeness test. And second, it fixes a standard, the limits of which are sufficiently determinate and determinable, to which the delegate must conform in the performance of his functions. This is called the sufficient standard test. So 2 tests, the completeness test and the sufficient standard test. A sufficient standard is one which defines legislative policy, marks its limits, maps out its boundaries and specifics, and specifies the public agency to apply it. It indicates the circumstance under which the legislative command is to be effected. So, completeness test, it must be complete, and there must be a sufficient standard. Abakada group. And one is a example sa delegation of power sa example na delegated power kanang sa mga administrative agencies mo fix sila og tax or impost. Now, exemption of government entities, agencies, and instrumentalities. What is the rationale of the exemption of government entities from taxation? Answer. Now, properties of the national government as well as of the LGU are not subject to tax. Otherwise, it will result in the absurd situation where the government is taxing money from one pocket and putting it in another. Ikan tas tao niya, tax na pa rin mo, tapos lain. The Board of Assessment Appeals of Laguna versus the Court of Tax Appeals in 1963. It is a matter of policy. The state cannot be taxed without its consent, and such consent being in derogation with sovereignty is strictly to be construed. Gomez versus Palomar in an American case. Discuss the taxability of government agencies. Primero, government entities. Kani government agencies. Agencies performing governmental functions are exempt from tax unless expressly taxed So, if you're performing governmental functions, okay, if you're performing governmental functions, so isa dila na minaw deron. If you're performing governmental functions, exempted from tax, unless taxed expressly. While if you're performing proprietary functions or functions involving property, proprietary functions are subject to tax unless exempted. So, bali, if it's a governmental function, exempt unless taxed. If it's a proprietary function, taxed unless exempted. Now, so you must know the distinction between the governmental function and the proprietary function. Gingon na ron use mga use imperi. Discuss the taxability of government-owned and controlled corporations. Government-owned or controlled corporations perform proprietary functions. Hence, they are subject to taxation unless exempted. Okay, proprietary function. What GOCCs have been granted tax exemptions? The following GOCCs are considered tax exemptions. Number 1, GSIS. Number 2, SSS. Number 3, PhilHealth. Number 4, local water districts as amended by the train law. So, ang local water district na dili na siya they are no longer taxable. They've been granted tax exemption. Note, before the train law, so pa ang train law, PCSO was included among the tax-exempt entities under Section 27, Paragraph C. Pursuant to the amendments by the train law of the NIRC, or the National Internal Revenue Code, the income of PCSO is now subject to tax. NIRC is amended by the train law. Amana ni ron, PCSO is a government agency, tax na po siya. Ang problema, ang tax sa PCSO ang gipasa dito sa winner. So ang winner mabayad og tax na bayaran na ng tax. So kanang ito mga sortres mabayad na. Okay. Is an instrumentality of the government subject to real property tax. Di sa natin diskusyon kay sunod-sunod ni siya nga mga issues. Instrumentalities of government. Real property tax, din income tax ha. Na maglibog kita magkaigsunan kay taxation ba, dagan mag siyang classes tax niya. Ang atong una nga income tax, in this case, property tax, RPT, real property tax, is an instrumentality of the government subject to real property tax. Like MCIAA or MIAA. And when a government instrumentality is vested with corporate powers, does it become a corporation subject to taxation? So these are issues. So mga exemption, taas na istorya ha. Unya tayo discuss na ha. Anyway, kini ang episode 16 sa Ignoratia Legis. Nag-discuss na, first time nag-discuss na sa introductory to Principles of Taxation. Episode 16, Ignoratia Legis. Kini si Jeteben sa October 2, 2020. Thank you and good afternoon. Salamat sa inyong pagkiguban kanako. See you tomorrow. Friday na ba? Saturday. See you Monday. Thank you.